You ready for me to go? Okay. All right. Well, let me start my timer. Okay. Well, if there are any of you guys in here who are bibliophiles like me, you may well remember the annual Eighth Day Books book catalog that used to come out every single year back in the day. And I can remember when that came out, I would wait for that thing with bated breath every single year. And when it finally released, I would go down to Eighth Day Books and I would get it, and I would go straight home and I would go get myself a highlighter, and then I would just pore over this thing for hours, highlighting all the books that I wanted to get. And it was in one of the years when that came out, and I'm not sure when the exact year was. My guess would be it was sometime between 2008 and 2010. But I came across a book review for a book called Meditations on a Theme by someone I had never heard of named Metropolitan Anthony Bloom. And so I went to Eighth Day Books and decided I am going to buy this book. I lucked out because they had a used copy, so I saved money. And I went home and I opened it and I began to read. And on the very first page, on the very first paragraph of this book, I was hit with a jolt. And I'm going to read the section that particularly hit me between the eyes. Metropolitan Anthony writes, "The kingdom of God is to be conquered. It is not something which is simply given to those who leisurely, lazily wait for it to come. For those who would wait for it in that spirit, it will come indeed. It will come at the dead of night. It will come like the judgment of God, like the thief who takes us unawares, like the bridegroom who comes when the foolish virgins are asleep." And the whole book was full of sentences like this. They were like a punch to the sternum. That was kind of how I felt. The operative descriptive phrase when I think about it is like smelling salts. These sentences and these paragraphs that jolted you awake. But at the same time, the book wasn't all like punch and power. It had this pastoral warmth that just coursed through the whole thing, and even almost a friendliness in the tone. He could move back and forth in his tone from firm and challenging to, almost just this lighthearted casualness. And it reminded me in a number of places very much of C.S. Lewis in that way. I was quite taken with the book, quite dazzled by it. And in many respects, that's an apt description of what it is like to encounter Metropolitan Anthony Bloom. He was a man who generated very intense reactions, as much in his person as he did in his writing and in his speaking. His biographer, named Gillian Crowe, who was his spiritual daughter, said, "Metropolitan Anthony was a person one could not encounter without being moved in one direction or the other." He was an intense, overwhelming personality, however it was that a person encountered him. He said in more than one of his books that Christians and followers of Jesus Christ should be such that whoever looked at them would be left puzzled, perturbed, and challenged. And he embodied that in his whole person. He was probably more responsible than any other single person for introducing orthodoxy to a wide-scale audience in Great Britain in the 20th century, and for getting 20th century British orthodoxy up onto its feet. He also had no small part in spreading orthodoxy here in America through the popularity of his books, which were intensely popular in the 70s and in the 1980s. They were widely read in a time when English language resources on orthodoxy and from Orthodox writers were really quite rare, and there weren't a whole lot of them. Although it was not typically orthodoxy itself that Metropolitan Anthony was interested in preaching or writing about, which is not to say it was unimportant. It was his own Orthodox faith was the well out of which he drew for everything that he had to say. And so in that sense, orthodoxy courses across the pages of all of his books. But rather his books and his media work, his public speaking, were nets that were just thrown wide. They were nets that were just aimed at a broad audience, and that were aimed above all else with impelling people towards a deeply personal faith in Jesus Christ, in an encounter with Jesus Christ that was deeply and profoundly personal. His own life had been changed in just such a way by a very personal and a completely and utterly unexpected encounter with Jesus Christ that happened to him when he was a young man. And that one encounter that he had suffused everything that his life was given to and everything that his life became after that particular moment. One of the things he said in more than one of his books, and that he said in a number of his public speaking, was, "I know God because I have met him." And he went about his calling to awaken people to this, to awaken people to the reality of God's interest in each of them personally, with what can only be described as a complete and utter abandon. He had the burning passion of a meteor, wrote Crow, which was breathtaking, so long as one was not the victim of his fire, as people were from time to time. And we'll talk more about that as we get in. So with that as our introduction, let's go ahead and get rolling for Metropolitan Anthony. He was born Andrei Borisovich Bloom, the only child of Boris Bloom and his wife Zhenya, on June 19th, 1914 in Lausanne, Switzerland. Boris was a Russian diplomat, and the family moved quite frequently. In his first 6 years of life, they lived in 10 different homes, moving from Lausanne, then to Moscow, and then they moved into Persia, which is modern-day Iran. They lived in a number of cities in Persia. The one they spent probably the longest at was in Tehran, and you can see a picture of the embassy in Tehran where Boris worked right there. It was an upper-class life. They lived in nice homes. They attended nice parties. Everywhere they went, they had a household staff. They had a nanny who traveled with them for the first 4 years of Andrei's life. It was very much a life of high society, and it was not to last. Boris, with the Bolshevik Revolution in November of 1917, Boris is a representative of the monarchy, the Russian monarchy, and so it became a very dangerous position for him. And so in 1920, he arranged with an escort of mercenary bandits to take Zhenya, his wife, her mother Olga, who lived with them, and little Andrei out of the country. And they left behind nearly every single possession that they owned. And they went up traveling in winter by horseback through the Kurdistan Mountains, and then eventually making their way through many twists and turns, which I don't have time to get into, but eventually making their way to Paris in France, which had become a sort of hotbed of the Russian expatriate community. And so they make it to Paris, and Paris is the beginning of a new life for all of them, for Andrei and for all of his family. And it's the beginning of a life marked by poverty. Zhenya, his mother, who had commanded whole household staffs, has to find work as a maid herself. And so did her mother, in order to scratch things together. Boris didn't join them for 3 years. And when he arrived there, he found work as a construction day laborer for the rest of his life. They were so poor that the family couldn't even afford to live together. The 3 adults had to find individual sort of studio rooms in different parts of the city, and Andrei kind of shuffled between all 3 while they were there. Zhenya and Boris's marriage sadly did not last and survive the strain, and they divorced only a few years after he arrived. School life for young Andrei was very, very difficult. The only school that they could afford was a slum boarding school in one of the worst sections of the city, and it was a violent and Darwinian atmosphere for him. He was bullied terribly when he first got there. He was beaten regularly when he arrived, and the teachers were no help in this. On one particular occasion, he was being beaten up by a group of boys. He extracted himself, and he ran to a teacher looking for help, and the teacher physically kicked him back into the melee and said, "Fight." And so he learned. He spent until 1926 in that environment, and he would say later on, "Never in all my whole life have I endured so much fear and pain, both physical and emotional. All the things I learned there, apart from endurance, I had to spend the rest of my life unlearning." Something of the horror of that environment can be seen in the fact that decades later, when he was in his 50s, he was back in Paris, and he was riding on the bus and didn't realize where they were in the city, and he looked up while he was on the bus, and they happened to be passing his old boarding school. And when he looked up and saw it, he fainted in his seat on the bus. A key turning point in his life happened in 1927 when he became involved with an extracurricular kind of YMCA/Boy Scouts, scouting group called the Russian Student Christian Movement. And it was something that really helped him. He loved the activities outdoors. He loved the sports. He loved volleyball. He developed a lifelong passion for the sport of volleyball, and he loved the camaraderie. In fact, he loved just about everything about the Russian Student Christian Movement except the religious instruction. He hated that. And regarding his own family's religious convictions, there were none. He had been baptized in Lausanne at the local Greek Orthodox parish, but it was purely a formality. His family went to church once a year, and that was on Good Friday. And young Andre, contrived a manner to even get out of this. He was an asthmatic. And so when he would go to church, he would begin deeply inhaling the incense to induce a coughing fit, so he would pass out, and then he would get hauled out and avoid having to be in church. The RSCM had summer camps that he deeply, deeply loved, but he refused to attend the church services that went with them. And when the bell would ring for Sunday Divine Liturgy at the camp, he would roll back the flap of his tent so that he could sort of defiantly show all the leaders, hey, I'm here, I'm awake, but I'm not coming out. But his life would begin to change in the spring of 1929. He was attending an evening gathering of the RSCM, and he was talked by one of the group leaders into attending the religious teaching session ahead of the sports. They had a speaker that evening who was Father Sergei Bulgakov, who very famous Russian theologian of the time, brilliant, brilliant man, terrible in communicating to teenage boys, though, apparently, because he got up and he spoke, and his presentation was, to Andre's mind, so patronizing, so childish and sentimental that he was utterly incensed by it. And it motivated him. He thought, if this is what Christianity is, then it's worthless. It has nothing for me. It is a child's bedtime story. And so instead of getting up to go play in sports, he literally ran home because he said, I am going to read the Bible and prove to myself that if this is indeed what Christianity is, I can be done with it now and just leave it be. He found a copy of the Gospels, was deeply distressed to find out there were 4 of them, picked out Mark because it was the shortest, and began to read. And what happened next was something that he would spend the rest of his life talking about. And I will use his words to describe it. The feeling I had occurs sometimes when you are walking along on the street, and suddenly you turn round because you feel someone is looking at you. While I was reading before I reached the beginning of the 3rd chapter, I suddenly became aware that on the other side of my desk there was a presence. This was so striking that I had to stop reading, and I looked up, and I looked for a long time. I saw nothing, heard nothing, felt nothing with my senses, but even when I looked straight in front of me at the place where there was, no one was visible. I had the same intense knowledge. Christ is standing here, without doubt. And I realized if Christ is standing here, then he is alive. And that means he is the risen Christ. And I knew from my own personal experience that Christ was risen, and therefore everything that it said about him in the gospel is true. And the experience changed the rest of his life. One of the things he would say over and over again in public speaking was, God for me is a fact. A fact. In a televised conversation with a prominent atheist that was televised on the BBC, he was asked how it was that he could believe in God, and he responded to her, it seems to me that the word belief you use is misleading. It gives the impression of something optional. I lost my place. Which is within our powers to choose or not to choose. I believe because I know God exists. And I am puzzled at how it is that you can not know. He actually would keep the desk that this whole encounter happened with him for the rest of his life. Wherever he moved, the desk went with him. It meant a great deal to him. And he threw himself from that point on in his life into the church, into its services, reading the Bible, reading the lives of the Desert Fathers in particular. And he decided he wanted to become a monastic and a priest. And so At age 18, he met with Father George Florovsky, another very famous Russian theologian living in Paris at the time, who met with him, and then Father Florovsky told him, "You're not ready. Go away and read the lives of the saints and read the church fathers, and then come back in 15 years. And so instead of heading off to seminary at 18 years old, Andre headed off to the Sorbonne to begin training to become a doctor. He was very academically gifted, and he easily got into medical school after earning his degree in natural science. He was articulate, he was intensely confident, bordering almost on cocky, was darkly handsome, as you could see from a number of those pictures up there. The female nursing students flocked to him. They very much were drawn to him at the time. But he was very much intent that the monastic path was what his vocation was and what he was called to. Although there was a story from the time that he did like to tell sometimes regarding this, about how one time there were a group of female nursing students around him, and there was one among their number who kind of fancied herself as somebody who dabbled in palm reading. And so she asked if she could read his palm, and he said, "Okay, go ahead." And he held his palm out to her. And after a short bit, she suddenly gasped and stepped back and looked at him just like she was angry. And he said, "What? What did you see?" And she said, "You will never marry, but you will have many children." And all of the women just looked at him like he was like an absolute scoundrel. He said, "No, no, no, I'm going to be a monk." And they wouldn't believe it, and they stormed off. Well, several decades later, that same nurse showed up in London when he's a famous bishop at his cathedral. And she went up to him afterwards, and she said, "You might not remember me." And he did. He never forgot a face, even if it was decades later. And tons of stories like this about that. And he said, "No, I remember you. And you know what?" He said, "What you said was true. I never married." And then he put his arms up in the congregation. He said, "And look at all my children." And that's what he called his parishioners, were his children. He always referred to them in that way. At any rate, he earned his medical license in 1939, and World War II was about to break out. And so shortly after he earned that, he was drafted into the French Medical Corps. He had become a French citizen in 1937, and he was made a field surgeon. And 5 days before he was drafted, on August 29th, on the feast of the beheading of St. John the Forerunner, he actually had taken monastic vows privately with his spiritual father with the intent on being formally tonsured as a monk after the war. And he was posted by the army in a field hospital close to the front. And there are so many stories about his time there. I could do a whole hour-long message just on the stories from his time during the war, but I won't do that. I'll just highlight a couple of them because they speak to aspects of his ministry later on. Number one, there was an event one time where the hospital boiler broke down from clogging and a lack of maintenance, and it caused there to be no heat, no warm water being supplied to one whole ward of the hospital. And when it was slow to be fixed, Andre gets up and he strips off his uniform. He went down there, he fixed the boiler himself, unclogged it, and began to stoke it with coal. And the other medical officers were just furious at him for this. They said, "You are degrading the rank of an officer. You should have found some orderly and made them do this." And Andre had none of this. He refused to apologize, and he said that they were all fools for putting, matters of rank above the needs of a functioning boiler and the needs of the patients. And for the rest of his time, they actually banned him from the officers' mess hall, and they banned him from the officers' lounge, said, "You go eat with the orderlies, since that's what you want to be." And this is a trait that followed him throughout his ministry. He often felt that institutional structures and formalities got in the way, and he was not shy about kicking them to the side. And he hated, even when he was a Metropolitan, hated being called Your Grace or Eminence. Usually what he introduced himself as, even as a Metropolitan, was as Father Anthony, and that's what he preferred for people to call him. He thought that hierarchical liturgies were too fluffy and long, and so when he would celebrate them, he pared them down considerably because he thought that they made too much of the bishop's presence. When young priests would come and serve at the cathedral when he was a bishop, Oftentimes, not every time, but oftentimes, he would actually attend to them as their server. He would wear nothing but a cassock, and he would, attend to the censer, prepare the censer, hand it to them, kiss their hand, and then go before them holding the candle. For most of his life as a bishop, he saw to the vast majority of the maintenance of the cathedral and the church himself. And a lot of times people didn't know about this. Into his 70s, he did this, including at the cathedral. After the Pascha service, he would wait for everybody to go home. And then he would go by himself. And he did this into his 70s when it got found out accidentally that he was doing it. And they were horrified to know that their 70-year-old bishop was going into the cathedral and with a scraper scraping off the floor all the candle wax in the cathedral. He would spend hours doing this after Pascha. And then they put together a team and said, you stop doing that. He wore his cassocks until they were utterly in tatters. They were in horrible condition sometimes. When it was hot outside, he'd go in sandals or he'd walk around barefoot. And a great story connected with this is once when he was in Moscow, he was meeting with the patriarch. And the patriarch was just embarrassed at the state of his cassock. And he said, okay, here, take one of mine. We're about the same size. And Metropolitan Anthony didn't want to because, you see, it was hot outside, and so there was nowhere to change but in the patriarch's quarters, and all he was wearing under the cassock was a pair of boxer shorts. And so he tried to demurely decline and say, no. But the patriarch, wasn't hearing any of this, and he said, don't be shy, man. I've seen a priest in trousers before, to which Metropolitan Anthony replied, perhaps, but you haven't seen one without his trousers. And to which the patriarch was rather horrified to find this out. Back to his time as a doctor, he was scrupulous about treating enemy prisoners of war who came to him in the same way he treated the French soldiers. On one occasion, there was a captured German soldier who was brought in with a partially crushed forefinger, and the triage doctor said simply, take it off, because he wasn't willing to devote the time and the resources to healing a wound like that in an enemy combatant. The soldier, though, was a watchmaker by trade, and so he needed his fingers to do intricate work, and he pleaded with them not to take off his finger because of the damage that would do to his livelihood. And Andre stepped in and insisted, I'll take care of him. And the triage doctor was just like, okay, fine, if you want to do that, you can do that, but you do it on your own time. You're not doing it on shift time. And so he did. He went after his shift, performed the operation, and then on his own time, he saw to the care of that man's finger, and it was restored. And he went away from that hospital eventually with his finger intact. He had occasion to be with many soldiers when they died, and he was known to sit beside unconscious patients and to read the Gospels to them out loud, to sing the hymns of the church to them, praying that God would awaken them to allow them to make their peace with him, if that was what they needed. And many did. And this didn't just extend to, the ones where he was just with them. There was an occasion once where there was a soldier that he was attending to, and it was clear that he was going to die. And so he was a Protestant, so they called for the Protestant chaplain to come. And before the chaplain arrived, the man passed into unconsciousness. And the Protestant chaplain got there, and he saw him, and he said, well, there's nothing I can do for him now. And it just infuriated, Metropolitan Anthony that he did this, and he told the man to stay where he was, and he went and he got a book of the Gospels. He opened it to the story of Lazarus. He shoved it at the man, turned him around, and he said, now you read this to him, start with this story, and you don't stop reading until he wakes up. 2 days later, the man woke up, and he was able to make his peace with God before eventually passing away. After France, and he did this for the whole of his ministry, even when he never thought someone should die alone. And he would go and he would sit with his parishioners, and there are many, many stories from people who saw him do this, read and sing to parishioners as they passed. After France fell to the Nazis in the summer of 1940, he snuck back into Paris. He forged his own documents to do it, where he worked at the Hospital Broca and the Hotel Dieu. You can see the pictures of the Hotel Dieu, the Hostel of God, a large hospital right next to Notre Dame. You can see its architecture right there. And he joined the French resistance, funneling medical supplies to the resistance in Paris, treating resistance fighters who had been wounded in sort of like back alley and in basement rooms, like a sort of, quasi-mob doctor. He was one they could call, who they could go, and who would help them. He used a hospital ambulance to ferry resistance workers around the city. And when he found out on one occasion that a number of patients in one of his wards were earmarked by the Germans to be sent off to a labor camp, and some of them were earmarked to be sent for experimentation somewhere, he went in and he covertly doctored all their x-rays to make it appear that they had tuberculosis. Like the whole ward is infected with tuberculosis. So therefore, an infectious disease, and so it allowed them to avoid being transferred out. He was arrested at least once and interrogated, although he was released. In the midst of this time, during Holy Week of 1943, he was formally tonsured a monk. And he took the name Anthony after St. Anthony Pekersky, who was the founder of the Kiev Caves Monastery. And another interesting thing, very much interesting from this particular time, his life is like an adventure novel. He was made part of French General Charles de Gaulle's personal security team as the team physician. And he liked to share his memories from the Victory Day parade of August 26, 1944, after Paris was retaken. And there's famous pictures of Charles de Gaulle leading a mass procession under the Arc de Triomphe down the Champs-Élysées, and Metropolitan Anthony is in the midst of that entourage with Charles de Gaulle's team, and he would talk about there were still random rogue German snipers in the city who were taking pot shots at them, and how he was like walking in the parade hunching over while de Gaulle is just out there in front just strutting. And he was always kind of taken with that and the man's courage. The local bishop had become one of his medical patients, and so it was at his invitation that finally the time came for Andre to be ordained to the priesthood, or Anthony now to be ordained to the priesthood. And he was on November 14th, 1948, 16 years after he had first gone to meet with Florovsky as an 18-year-old boy and told, come back in 15 years. It was also around this time that his mother returned to the church after a lifetime of non-observance and was a faithful parishioner for the rest of her life. The one thing she could not abide, though, was the thought of her son having a beard in the traditional Orthodox clerical fashion. So out of deference to her and with the permission of his bishop, he went clean-shaven until her death in 1958. You can see a number of pictures of him from that time. The one on the right I like. He was very close friends with the famous theologian Vladimir Lossky. He grew up, and Lossky's children kind of regarded him as their surrogate uncle, as it were, and had many, many memories of him. He was not long for ministry in France, however, because in January of 1949, he packed his bags and he moved with his mother and his grandmother to take a job in London as the Orthodox chaplain with the Fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius. This was an organization which was an ecumenical organization between Orthodox and Anglican theologians and lay people. It had been founded in the 1920s with the aim of sort of fostering theological dialogue between the Orthodox and the Anglicans and working towards unity with them. And this was at a time in the 1920s and later when Anglicanism was much, much closer to Orthodoxy in its theology and its ecclesiology than it is today. And they held conferences, they held retreats, they had a formal journal, they had regular gatherings to talk about things. And this was a big deal. There were a lot of big-name people on both sides who were involved in this. You can see a picture right there. There's Father George Florovsky on the right, who was very active in it as well. And the previous Orthodox chaplain who Anthony was coming to take over for was Father Sergei Bulgakov. And there's a picture of him, the very priest whose really bad presentation 20 years ago had been the impetus for Anthony's own conversion experience. That's the one who he was coming to take over for. He had gotten the job through his connections with the RSCM. He still remained very involved with them, and he had gained a reputation over the previous 2 years. Had Metropolitan Anthony as a very, very dynamic speaker, and he was in French and in Russian. When he took the job to go to London, he didn't speak one lick of English. But it didn't really prove a problem for him because he was a polyglot. He was a genius with languages, and he could pick them up remarkably fast. And so in his case, the way he did it was he would read the Oxford Dictionary, and he read the King James Bible, and he would go about the town listening to people talk. And he picked it up very, very quickly. He would retain close ties with the Fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius for the rest of his life. And he was a very, very frequent speaker at their many conferences and at their many retreats. You can see a number of pictures. But he did that to the very end of his life. And this is probably a good place for me to maybe mention a word or two about one of the things that Metropolitan Anthony did receive criticism about both during and after his life, and that was his ecumenical activities with other non-Orthodox Christians. He was very much a frequent speaker at gatherings and conferences of multiple Christian groups. He frequently spoke as a guest speaker at various churches, at various conferences. He was involved throughout the 1960s and into the early 70s with the World Council of Churches as a member of its Christian Medical Commission. He got a lot of criticism from that. And he would often attend Episcopal consecrations of Anglican bishops, not as a participant, quite obviously, but just as an observer. And in his view, and this was something that was very important to him, in his view, it was possible to engage, to speak, to have dialogue without, and to cooperate, as it were, in helping those who were needy, and to do that without compromising his very firm conviction in what orthodoxy is, as the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church founded by Jesus Christ. He saw this in many ways as a way for him to witness for orthodoxy, to take orthodoxy to people who would not otherwise have heard of it, would not otherwise be able to engage with it. And so that was kind of it was very much how he approached this particular work that he had. He was made rector in 1950 after about a year and a half with the fellowship of St. Philip the Apostle Parish. You can see a picture of what it would have looked like roughly about that time. It was a small parish under the Moscow Patriarchate in London, and it shared its building with a separate parish community that was associated with the Russian Church in exile, the Russian Church abroad, or the forerunner of ROCOR, as we know it now. And this was an interesting relationship. It was a somewhat tense relationship because of the compromised position of the Russian Church under the Soviet government. The Russian Church in exile viewed the Moscow Patriarchate as illegitimate, and they viewed many of the parishes that were still underneath of it as by proxy illegitimate. But because they shared the same building, and actually the parish here was the result of a split in the original church that had happened in the 20s over this very, very, very issue. And because they shared the same building, Father Anthony thought that he should meet the Church in Exile parish priest, a man named Father Vitali, and establish a relationship. And so he sought him out to do that. And Father Vitali was rather horrified that here's this, not only is he under the Moscow Patriarchate, but he's clean shaven and he's got short hair, so that didn't impress him very much. But they did meet once a month to go over sort of practical issues related to the maintenance of the parish. But for the entirety of his time there, when they shared a parish, Father Vitali insisted on re-blessing the entire church after every single Eucharist that Father Anthony performed. His association, Metropolitan Anthony's, with the Moscow Patriarchate was, throughout the Cold War era, was another thing that earned him criticism, both during and after his life. The Church of Exile, people in it often would call him the Red Bishop. And he was sensitive to this. He made sure he never drove anywhere in a red car. He didn't want to exacerbate the problem. And but it wasn't that he didn't understand things. He understood and recognized, the compromising position that the Russian church of the time was in. He understood and was aware that there were bishops who were KGB men, and that even among the leaders who weren't, they basically did whatever the Soviet government told them to. But at the same time, he knew that the church was basically being enslaved in order for its right to even be able to exist under the Soviet government. And for his own part, he was never shy about condemning communism. He was quite vocal about this as well. And he was not afraid to contradict the Russian church hierarchy if they gave him commands that he was deeply opposed to in some cases. In 1953, when Stalin died, he was told to perform a memorial service for him, and he wouldn't do it. And he was also very vocal in his support for Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And the Russian church hierarchy told him basically stop, because they were condemning Solzhenitsyn because the Soviet government was telling them to. And he said no. And he continued his public support for Solzhenitsyn. But for him, whatever compromises the Russian church had made, it retained in its liturgy and its religious life the apostolic faith. It had not fallen into any doctrinal heresy, and he believed quite firmly that he could have a better influence on it from within than he could by jumping ship to the church in exile and criticizing it from without. You do not abandon your family when it is in trouble, is what he said on more than one occasion. On another occasion, he said that the sinfulness of the current Russian church was compensated for by the reality of the many martyrs even then within her. But that was his take on that. As a priest at St. Philip's, he threw himself into the work, like he did with everything, with abandon, to establish what at the time when he came to it was a very fledgling small community. At his arrival, there were maybe 2 to 3 dozen immigrants who made up the parish. And it was a very cloistered environment, very, very kind of shut off from wider British culture.